All right. So as I said, as we were beginning just a moment ago, we want to make sure that our virtue is Christian virtue. And the reason I'm saying that is because we share this word with everyone from militant atheists to militant Islamists to self-help gurus and internet YouTube stars of millennial ages or less. So it's not that it's bad that we share this word with all those people. That's actually a good thing. But what that means is that if we want to talk about virtue as the way of right living for the Christian, we want to make sure we get this right because we are, in fact, Christians. As a great symbol of how this can kind of clash, if you've ever been in a bookstore and noticed that there are self-help books right next to the New Age religious books, right next to the Christian theology or devotional books. They cram all those things together, which every time I walk into a bookstore, for me, it's a little bit irritating because what they mean by that is so different that it's literally, if they're all trying to say, hey, we need some help, that they're offering actually very, very different means of help. And that's why we Christians, when we're offering help in the form of proposing virtue as a way of life, that we cannot fall into the traps of self-help nonsense. So this is a great quote from Walker Percy, Lost in the Cosmos, the last self-help book. It's a hilarious book if you ever have time. You live in a deranged age, more deranged than usual, because despite great scientific and technological advances, man has not the faintest idea of who he is or what he is doing. And he's writing that in the intro to talk about why it's sort of hilarious that these self-help books are propagating so much. And it's obviously because we need help. But one time when I was about 8 years old, I was on a job site with my dad and I wandered way into the woods. And now I know my memory in this is probably slightly exaggerated because I was a boy, but I fell into what at the time I would only describe as quicksand. And it was very quick. I was up to here. Okay, maybe here, but up to here, maybe here. But I was deep in what appeared to be quicksand to me. I think it was a drainage pond that just had like 4 feet of mud, but it was horrifying. I could not get out. And a man ran up to me because he heard me screaming. I was in the middle of the woods. I really thought nobody would find me. And all sorts of fears run through your head. But I'm screaming for help. He comes to help me. Literally the difference between some of these self-help new age books and secular things and Christian virtue is the difference on if that man handed me a brick to get out of there with, which would sink me. Okay, presumably maybe he could put on the bottom stand on, but let's just say it's a heavy brick and there's no bottom. Or he could hand me a flotation device so I don't sink any further, or he could hand me his hand and get me out of there. That's how different some of these proposals for how we live virtue is. And those of us that are in fraternists, we know that we're proposing virtue as a way of life and we're mentoring and trying to show and guide young men using that language. We need to make sure that we have this right so that we're actually not accidentally teaching them a false virtue that's like handing them a brick. And it doesn't matter if you're what setting or context in. If we have a deranged understanding of the self and virtue and all what it all means, we can start using the language of Christians, but it's false. It's wrong. So what I want to do, and just so you know, in this webinar, we're not going to do those fascinating dissections of all the different virtues, like the way Thomas Aquinas just breaks all the different parts, and this one is annexed over here to this one. And we're not going to do that. We're going to do that in some follow-up webinars. But for now, what we need to do, if we're as Christian men, I'm just presuming you're with me on this, that we're Christian men and we want to speak, live, and teach virtue in a way that is coming from Christ, then we've got to begin in Christ as an actual person. And the reason I say actual person is that we live in an age of idealism. And a lot of times we speak about Jesus as if he is an idea, as if he is a philosophy, as if he is one way among many, which literally contradicts the person, the historical reality of Christ. But we believe as Catholics, we just finished celebrating through Lent, Holy Week, Eastertide, and now an Ascensiontide awaiting Pentecost, that his body came to earth through the Blessed Virgin Mary, died, rose again, ascended into heaven, that these things actually happened. Sometimes it can be shocking when we speak about Christ as if he actually occurred, because it's comfortable when we're talking about ideas, but when there's this person who was present and who is still present, that can be uncomfortable. And we don't act that way. John Senior had a lot of critiques, favorite educator of mine. He said, no matter how much we profess, the facts of Christianity are not real to us because nothing is real to us. We live in a world of those multiplying books and everything, not to plunge deeper into some sort of truth, not to grow in understanding, but primarily because we're just trading ideas and maybe all of them or none of them are right. But whatever, as long as you're semi-happy or achieve some measurable or meager level of happiness, then we're going to be okay. So what we need to do in order to make Christ real and to talk about this topic of virtue is talk about where Jesus landed historically and geographically, the place. Because, you know, in the book of Galatians, it says of Christ that he came in the fullness of time. So a lot of it, because we're self-centered, we're modern men, we think we're the fullness of time. Look at what we've achieved. We've got the internet and atom bombs and other stuff, and we've been to the moon. Come on. This is the fullness of time. But no, scripture says that Jesus came at the fullness of time, meaning God, who sees the world not like this as a timeline, but all at one moment, all in an instant. He sees these things. He sees the moment that Christ came as the fullness of time. So why is that? What were the cultures in the place? Why was this moment perfect for the coming of God? Well, first of all, we have three different peoples. Think about the place of Jerusalem. Think about the peoples that were there. We've got the Jews, we've got the Romans, and then we've got the heavy influence of the Greeks, all in this place. So the Jews, obviously, we know, as Jesus said, salvation comes from the Jews, right? That is what the Jewish people were told by God. It was revealed to them. These are the people chosen by God, revealed that the Savior would come. And we know that they had many misunderstandings or misgivings about what exactly that would look like. They especially expected a political, semi-military leader to help Jerusalem and Israel as a nation coalesce, right? But that's what they're waiting for. So Jesus is a Jew. Jesus is a Jew. So he's coming in this Jewish culture. But who occupied Jerusalem at the time of Christ is obviously not the kings of the Jews totally, but we had these people, the Romans. Now, the Romans, if we're going to say that the Jews represented, they're trying to live for God. They're trying to live righteously. So we can say that they have justice, meaning in a sense, you know, justice in Latin means, Jews means right. They're trying to live righteously for God. We've got Romans that for us, they could represent the will. The Romans had conquered so much of the world that they had what they called the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, which was not brought about this. Let's just say this wasn't 1960s hippie peace. This was peace by brute force. That literally we come, we defeat your people, your military, because they're tiny compared to us. We're really good at what we do, and we impose our rule over you. While in a way, and this is what Rome was interesting, an interesting anomaly. We allow you to be your people in some ways, but you're still part of the Roman Empire. So we have instances, for example, when Jesus is on trial, when the chief priests say, "We have no king but Caesar," right? How interesting for a Jewish priest to say we have no king but Caesar, when actually what's interesting is that the heir to the throne is Christ himself right there, as coming from the line of David. And the intertwining of these cultures and these rules is important. And we need to remember that because, again, this is the fullness of time. So what else is the influence in this time? What other culture? We have the pagan Greeks. The Romans were also pagan. The Greeks were also pagan. What are the Greeks known for, though? They're known for their wisdom, for their philosophy. We like to claim that democracy comes from them. The Greeks gave us, if the Jews represent justice and righteousness, the Romans represent willpower and we could say very practical ingenuity. I mean, just think of the aqueducts. There are Roman bridges still in use today. They're just the sheer ingenuity and force and will of man. The Greeks represent the intellect, the mind, and even virtue itself, which they are the ones that really grabbed on to that word, right? They're the ones that really promoted it in a way and thought about it and thought it through to logical ends. This is so important that, you know, when Jesus in the New Testament, when he's quoting the Bible, right, when he's preaching, and he's quoting the Bible, and there's a Roman soldier over there, and there's someone who speaks Greek right there. And then he's also obviously maybe preaching around the Jews, the Pharisees, the scribes. Interestingly, the Bible he often quotes, the translation, we can tell he's actually quoting from a Greek translation of the Bible called the Septuagint. And that's a fascinating thing, that the Greek influence, they had basically translated the Bible from its ancient languages, from Hebrew, and they were quoting and discussing it in Greek. And this would have been understood because the Greeks were so desirous in their pursuit of wisdom that it made it natural to put it into their language. In fact, it's interesting when, in the famous 1 John, when we're talking about the Word was God, the Word was with God, and everything was made through the Word, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. The Greek word used there is "and the Logos was made flesh," which is a Greek word that they use, the philosophers use, to talk about the wisdom that permeates everything, that truth that we perceive that unites all things in truth. It's the Logos is what they called it. Sort of like this is like the word and the wisdom of everything. So when John says, yes, the word of God, the wisdom of everything, the coherence and truth of everything was made through him, and his name is Jesus, and he came to earth, and let me tell you about him, right? That's how he begins the gospel. So for opening the gospel of Matthew to a Jew, they would have been reading the lineage of the King David. Begot them, they begot him, he begot him, he begot him. Here's Jesus. Isn't that great? Because they know the historical lineage. When John begins, and the Logos was made flesh, that would have been shocking to the Jews. The old joke is if Plato made it to heaven and Jesus walked in the room, he goes, "Oh, it was you I was looking for. It was you the whole time." So this is a fascinating thing for us because, here we have this is a picture of a Byzantine priest reading from a Greek New Testament, right? Something that was written in the Roman Empire. And we have these things from St. Paul. Here are the Jews asking for signs and wonders. Here are the Greeks intent on their philosophy. But to us, Christ, the power of God, Christ, the wisdom of God. So all of this might seem like really interesting trivia to you. And maybe, why am I talking about this in the case, and we're trying to talk about virtue, why are we doing this history lesson? Well, let me tell you this, it might be cool trivia, but it is not trivial. This is critical for us to understand, because at this time, we as Christian men, for example, us in Fraternus, we go over and over and over the virtues of prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance, these cardinal virtues that all other virtues hang on. We propose virtue as the way to live the good life, the happy life, the life that will ultimately bring you to God. That language and those things of virtue, the cardinal virtues, that's not the Sermon on the Mount, right? So this is something that we have brought in from pagan culture. And as you guys might have some Protestant friends who might tell you, oh, Catholicism has imported all sorts of pagan things. Look at all their statues and stuff. They're obviously pagans. Well, I'm with G.K. Chesterton on this. They don't know what paganism means, and it's surely not here. However, there was paganism, as Chesterton said, and then there was Christianity. And in a sense, we did annex to ourselves a great understanding of the moral life, but we got to make sure when we teach it that we fully baptize the way that the early church did, because there was some people who weren't for it. So one of the most popular quotes to talk about this is Tertullian, who said, "What has Jerusalem to do with Athens?" Meaning, what has the church got to do with the academy, with the college, with the university? The church with the academy, the Christian with the heretic. After Jesus, we have no need of speculation. After the gospel, no need of research. As some of them would say, we had the wisdom of Solomon. Why do we need Aristotle? Why do we need Plato? Why do we need Socrates? And this was a big debate within the early church. And this is the debate that I'm saying is still actually raging, that I'm bringing up. That in some cases we need to be careful because we might be losing the vision of Christ himself. So who was one of the ones that obviously helped us to bring these things to actually, in a sense, annex the territory of the pagans while making it truly Christian? In other words, really baptizing these teachings. Well, probably the most famous of these would have been St. Augustine. So St. Augustine, I mentioned in some of the advertising for this webinar, the idea of pagan virtue. And a lot of people might have heard that and thought, oh, I don't want my virtue to be pagan because pagan is bad because I'm Christian. I don't want it to be pagan. But the reason we can talk about pagan virtue now is that St. Augustine saw the virtue of the pagans, meaning even in the book of his Confessions, the way he speaks about the goodness and the virtue of his friends, it actually made him sad to think that they wouldn't come to know the God that he came to know, because he saw that the Greeks in the philosophy of the Greco-Roman culture, what they had achieved is literally the highest point possible of the human intellect. And do you know what that achievement brought them? What conclusion that brought them to? Well, if we look at the person of Socrates, he literally died because he taught there was not a multitude of gods, but there was one God. And that life should not be lived in the pursuit of worldly wealth and advancement, but for goodness alone. And for these things, he died. So obviously, this is why some of the early church would have actually called some people like Aristotle, Plato. They would have literally called them Christians. I believe it was Saint Justin Martyr who literally claims that Socrates was, in a sense, an unknowing Christian, because the God he was pursuing and that he had almost reached with his mind alone came to earth. So just like I was stuck in that mud, unable to get out, the flotation device that gets you as high as possible and keeps you surviving in a certain way, sane, your head above water, but still stuck, is that flotation device. That was really the pagan philosophers. They'd gotten as close as they could. But it's Christ by coming is the man who reaches down and brings them the rest of the way up. They can't go further. They had reached as far as the human intellect could. We could almost say the Romans had gone as far as the human will could come. And even the Jews, based on the revelation from God alone, went as far as they could go without Christ reaching his hand and helping them go the rest of the way. So this is why St. Augustine brought this common ground. He said, what is it we share in common with our pagan friends? And this is a question for you. When you're discussing living virtuously with your family members that are atheists, with young men that are confused, with those that are breeding the new age nonsense on the bookshelf because in a bookstore they wanted help and they took a left instead of a right. Right? What do you say to them? What is it we really hold in common? And that thing is, and this is what St. Augustine said, everyone wants to be happy. Everyone will agree with me before the words are even out of my mouth. This is where all philosophers begin. And this is where all decent thinking begins. If we're going to live rightly, what is it we want? What are we trying to reach? What are we trying to get? Well, we want happiness. No one wills that they would be happy. Even if you're in high school, you remember like the Goths. If you went out of public school, I had the Goths at my school, and they're great. They're my friends. But they would dress in darkness and death and sadness and melancholy was their song. Why? Because they thought it would make them happy, right? Even in that instant, acting sad, they were acting sad to try to be happy. This is what the pagans, they arrived at this conclusion that it is not all of them, but the ones that we still quote today, and basically this, especially the Aristotle and his lineage on up to Thomas Aquinas. What did they want? Happiness. And what did they say? How we could get it? By living virtuously. By living virtuously. But that wasn't good enough. And that's why the Christians really had to baptize their understanding of virtue. And it might seem interesting why, but let me tell you how St. Augustine did. Let me read this quote from him. This is how he went about. Come on, this chat box is in the way. This is how he went about. So basically, in this passage, St. Augustine is saying, hey, those prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance, I'm with you on one condition. There is one thing we're trying to reach, and there is one thing that will make us happy, and there is one thing that will answer all the desires of our heart. Only one, and it's God. And there's only one way to reach God, and it's to love God. Not because of our own effort, but because he first loved us. So what we desire, when we perceive the truth of all things, and we reach up and we look to the stars, we have this sense of wonder and gratitude. You ever seen a sunrise, and you would just want to say, thank you? Oh, who am I talking to? It's God. In the pagan sense, yeah, I think it's God. They wanted to say thank you. They wanted to praise him, to get to know him, to live rightly, to go above. And God comes and he gives us his son so that we can come to him. So St. Augustine said all virtue, these four virtues, this is love acting in different ways. As to the virtue leading us to a happy life, he says, I hold virtue to be nothing else than the perfect love of God. So we may express it thus, that temperance is love keeping itself entire and incorrupt for God. Fortitude is love bearing everything readily for the sake of God. Justice is love serving God only, and therefore ruling well all else. As subject to man, ruling all else as subject to man. Prudence is love, making a right distinction between what helps it towards God and what might hinder it. That is St. Augustine's brilliant. So he took that, what does Athens to do with Jerusalem? Well, we are taking what humanity can do on its own. We're going to purge it and elevate it by grace, purging it from sin, elevating it by grace, bringing it to greater perfection. But we're going to say that, yes, there is pagan virtue because it's the virtue that's in the pagans. And since St. Augustine was able to do this, the moral teaching of the church has been brilliant and illuminating all the way up to Thomas Aquinas. For some of you, it might have arrived to you because of the modern era. It might have arrived to you that virtue in Christian living is something like following some sort of rules, as if prudence was a rule and justice was a rule and an obligation and a duty. But really, if we're taking Aquinas, the greatest moral teaching in the history of the church, who goes back to Aristotle, who was baptized by the church fathers in the teachings of Jesus and especially St. Paul, we're saying, no, it's the love of God that inspires our virtue. It's trying to seek that which we would desire most, which is happiness, which is better than we could ever have imagined, because it's beatitude. It's literally the sight of God. You thought virtue was good and living rightly and having justice brought you some sort of inner peace. That's what the pagan philosophers thought. It's better than inner peace. It's God himself. Not only that, he has united our humanity with himself through the ascension. So he brought our humanity up. And right now, as we're recording this, we're awaiting Pentecost. Then he gives us his spirit and it comes down. And we're united in this way that makes our virtue constantly going up towards heaven. So I say all that because there's a warning to us as Christians. We have to be careful that we don't let our Christianity fall back, our Christian virtue fall back into ideas of paganism, and also that we don't accept some of the ways that I think even secular society has annexed virtue and talks about it in a way that they don't understand, because they've inherited virtue ethics from Christianity. It does not arrive in the modern world through any other means. As Chesterton said, there's only one thing in the modern world that has been face to face with paganism. There's only one thing in the modern world which is that sense knows anything about paganism, and that is Christianity. I put that in there because there's also those who wish to talk about virtue and even extol paganism as if they know about it. But the thing is, there is no paganism anymore. What's being invented now and passed in New Age stuff and maybe even overt paganism up here in Asheville near me, the winter solstice and summer solstice and their dances and stuff, they're imitating and coming up with something totally new. It's not the culture of paganism. We know it, and it's actually been baptized, purged of its error, and brought in a lot of its teachings being brought in. Not the worship of false gods, in case that wasn't clear, but the understanding of especially the Greek philosophers brought. So there's three ways that we really fall back on trying to live virtue. And I hear this a lot. I mean, to be honest, I use this language sometimes by accident. And even within fraternists, sometimes I hear us using this language, and it's wrong. And that is treating the pursuit of virtue as if it's some sort of thing by itself. The fact is, prudence is love searching after God. Justice is love living rightly for God. Temperance is et cetera, as St. Augustine said. So all of we fail and we go backwards in our virtue when we forget to root it in the revelation of Christ, and that our ultimate end is not the perfection of self, but it's God himself. So this is why the growth in virtue cannot be done on a webinar or even reading books by yourself, but it's in the context of prayer, the devotional life, and the brotherhood that is native and natural to Christianity. So Servais Pinker is a brilliant theologian on moral virtue. He said, shaped by faith, moral formation, as a formation in virtue, takes place within the faithful's participation in the body of Christ. So virtue is the Christian life. We have to be careful not to fall backwards. The next thing, though, is that we befriend Plato's foe, the sophist. So Plato was very skeptical of the sophists. And if you're thinking, wow, this is more trivia, no, this is not trivial. So the pagans had two reasons essentially that they were pursuing virtue. The sophists were the ones that groomed themselves so that they would appear wise and virtuous, so that they could get paid to appear wise and virtuous, so that they could achieve higher ranks within society. I would say this falls very quickly in our modern world in the way that we try to pursue and grow in virtue, maybe in some sense of best practices, or maybe so that we can advance in our career. It's not a problem to want to be excellent in everything you do. The Gospels are very clear. He did all things well, the Gospel says. We can do all things well, but I know that we men, especially we men, we're engaged in the world of business and the world of work, it is easy for us to place our discipline that we're pursuing for the sake of worldly advancement. And if we sit silently and examine, why are we, everything from our exercise to our writing, to our communication, to our clothing, to our savviness with our businesses, all these things that we try to grow in these best practices, and think about how you probably get these advertisements on the web and stuff of like 3 secrets to help you a better salesman, this, that, all these things. Now, doing work well is good, but when we begin grooming our character for the sake of worldly advancement, we're becoming the sophists, and it's definitely not Christian virtue. Plato himself even fought against that. So he was super skeptical. If they were well-paid, well-groomed, and high achievers, this is in Joseph Pieper's work on Plato, if you're interested. If you're well-paid, well-groomed, and a high achiever, he doesn't trust your wisdom, your virtue, because he would accuse you that you're doing it for those reasons, to appear well-groomed, high-achieving, all this stuff. So just small examples. My children, when they begin to be aware of, hey, I like this clothing, it's like, great, put that clothes on, look good, do it well, tuck your shirt in, and forget about it, because now our eyes are on God, right? We're not checking ourselves in the mirror every time we pass one. So it's Friedrich Nietzsche, the famous atheist who said God is dead. He said, the era of the sophists, it's our time. Again, because he rejected God outrightly. He's the one who said we have to will ourselves to power. We're the sophists now. We have to make ourselves what we want to be because we have to achieve more. I'm tired of that humble, woe is me, groveling on your knees Christian nonsense. There is no God. Therefore, make yourself one. That's the message of Nietzsche, modern sophists, and that's a message a lot of us fail, especially if we read more books on perhaps growth and virtue from a secular perspective and not, no, this is our life helping us to achieve God. Because virtue is not an end. Virtue is a means to reach God. The other way that I think we fall very quickly into a pagan understanding of virtue is when we actually live in a contrived reality. So this picture here on the screen is really interesting. I'm going to see if I can get a pointer to show you guys. So this is an image of what's called Plato's cave. You ever heard of, the analogy of the cave by Plato? What he said, in trying to explain what the true life of wisdom and virtue is, he said, all of us begin in chains, right? So we're chained here in a cave. That's all we've ever known. We don't even know that we're in the cave when we're in the cave. And there's a fire over here burning, and there's a wall, and there's people walking by showing us images of things. So there's a wall, right, where people are projecting onto a screen images of things that aren't really there, meaning where you are fully present in the world, they're not there. I hope you guys are getting kind of spooked out at Plato's prophecy of our screens, right? The contrived reality of our screens. Hey, we're all on a screen right now. We get it. There's ways we can use this tool, but I'm actually not sitting next to you. And we're communicating in a way that's live, maybe a little bit more real, but our screens pose a great danger to our life of virtue because it molds our minds to receive everything that's coming across this screen, to receive it as the world gives it. And if people are like, yeah, man, people are brainwashed by that stuff on the screen, but they fail to see you're brainwashed. Meaning, if you're looking at anything, because the internet has a great way of consolidating us into ways of thinking. If you're there, you need to just say, I am one of them. I am in these chains. what Plato said, the hard thing to do is for us to get out of these chains, realize that those are just pictures, and to climb into the light to see reality as it is in all of its fullness, splendor, and terrible beauty. And he said that's a hard thing to do. It hurts our eyes. I don't know about you in the moral life, it hurts my eyes to look square at my sin for what it actually is. It hurts my eyes to realize I can't massage who I am on a screen and put bios on websites and invite you guys to webinars and say, this is Jason Craig. When this screen turns off, I have to open my eyes to reality. I have to examine my life. As those pagan philosophers said, the unexamined life is not worth living. Plato says we got to get off these screens and get out. And the great philosopher Joseph Pieper, he said, to be open to the truth of real things and to live by perceived truth. These constitute the essence of the moral person. This is in some of his works on virtue. Meaning you have to be open to reality, meaning you have to see reality. So I know for certain, and we know this from anecdotally, from science, from studies, but our own intuition confirms this. If we live a life on the screen, we won't be able to live virtuously because we've, in a sense, bowed out of the real life and have accepted the contrived life that's there. I'm not saying we don't use it at all. We're on a webinar, but there is a huge danger to our moral life. The biggest reason is related to that second one, that on the screen, we can project. We can be the ones behind the screen projecting to ourselves in the chains what reality is. Or we've got our friends and our neighbors in chains behind the screen, and we're floating across the screen, our status, our pictures, all sorts of things. This is my life. There's nothing that brings me more pain than to know when people are in deep pain. And this is actually one of the reasons I quit Facebook. To know people, to get to know them in friendship and in love and in deep and real relationships, and then to see the image that they project on the screen and realize that's not them. Well, it's not them, then who is it? Well, it's these things on the wall, literally on the wall, in the Facebook wall. I know, it's amazing, the analogy, but we have to escape that. And I want to just, it's a big poo-poo on webinars to have a long quote, but please do your best to stick with this real quick. Joseph Pieper, wait, before you read it, Joseph Pieper said that curiosity is the vice. When we have finally given up on living a life of virtue, what we need is curiosity. St. Paul would call it itching ears. We need something to see to distract us that we're unable to sit in a room with ourselves. Right? So all of us who've been locked up, thanks to coronavirus, in our rooms with our screens, Blaise Pascal said the greatest cross, the greatest challenge of modern man is that he can't sit in a room alone. But now we have a way to never be alone, but to always be void of what aloneness can give. Because aloneness and solitude and silence is where we can reflect on ourselves and find God. But what too easily happens is that we go into the screen with curiosity. Curiositas, the Latin word for it, can be the sign of one's fatal uprooting, meaning the killing uprooting. It can signify that a person has lost the capacity to dwell in his own self, that he, fleeing from himself, disgusted and bored with the waste of an interior that is burnt out with despair, seeks 1,000 futile ways with selfish anxiety, that which is accessible only to the high-minded calm of a heart disposed to self-sacrifice and thus in mastery over itself, in and towards the fullness of being. That's lofty. It is. He's writing a lofty thing, but what he's saying is that when we fail to live virtuously, within us, we grow darker and darker and darker, and we get tired of ourselves, and we need just something to distract us from that. And that literally keeps us. This quote comes from a little book called The Virtues of the Human Heart. It's on how to live virtuously. Brilliant, beautiful book. And it's literally in that book, he's saying when we fail, when we give up, in a sense, on the rigor and the silence and the reflection and the prayer that's necessary for virtue, we go out looking for screens to scroll through. So I'm going to go very fast. So how do we and I hate to give 3 easy ways to get out of this. It sounds contrived, but really, seriously, if we're going to rebaptize our understanding of virtue, always, always, always God first. Next, always, always, always fraternity, in the context of fraternity. That's where we live the Christian life. And I know that might seem strange because I said that corresponds to like seeking, business acumen for the sake of being a good businessman. I'm saying that if we don't live our primary identity within the fraternity of Christianity, within our faith, then we're going to fail. We're going to end up joining, in a sense, the tribe of the secular business world or whatever world is pulling us away. So we've got God first, we've got fraternity, and lastly, silent real estate. What I mean by that is we have to have actual silence. We have to encounter real things. You know how in the investment world, you have stocks and bonds and all these things that somehow lose and gain money, even though nothing actually happened in your life, but somewhere around the world, people's spreadsheets traded some numbers and now you're richer or poorer. But if that were to happen right now, if in this webinar you got a bunch of stocks and they just lost value, nothing actually happened to you in your real estate, meaning where you are presently. So as the investment of land, real estate is a place that you can stand on no matter what happens. We have to invest our time in silent real estate, meaning the reflection, the prayer, and the reading and the learning that's necessary to grow in virtue. If you are signing on this webinar looking for some quick, easy tips so that you won't be a pagan and you'll be more virtuous, I don't have it for you, because the work of it is a whole lifetime of that silent real estate. We're putting God first and we're living in the context of the fraternity that is Christianity. So I want to thank you all for coming. Obviously, I can't end without saying that is a big part of the two missions that brought this webinar to you today. One, of course, is Sword&Spade magazine, which we've published very much with men in mind, the men that are in the trenches. We both write from them and to them while mingling serious intellectual thought and the teachings of the church and serious theology, but we also try really hard to make it accessible, and that we're speaking to and from the experience of real men that are in the trenches. So I hope you join that. Obviously, if you're interested in Fraternus is basically a framework where we can live this out. So it's an intergenerational brotherhood that gets established at a parish where the men of a parish come together, unite themselves in fraternity, and then invite the young men, their own sons, and the men of the parish that might not have fathers or mentors, bring them into that adult and mature world. My name is Jason Craig. Thank you so much for attending this webinar. I'm going to end the recording, but I'm going to hang around and answer any questions if you have them. Thank you for coming. God bless.